The penthouse atop the Latte World Tower didn't feel like a residence. It felt like a monument to a man who had conquered the world but lost his soul. Outside, the neon veins of Seoul pulsed with life, but inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and hauntingly still. Mr. Kang, the man the tabloids called the Iron Shadow, sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 20, yet he ate in a solitude so profound it felt violent. To the Syndicate, he was a god of discipline who could dismantle a rival's empire with a single phone call, but here, under the soft glow of Italian chandeliers, he was just a man drowning in a silence he couldn't control. Across from him sat Yuna. She was a porcelain doll in a pale blush dress, her small hands resting motionless beside a plate of food she hadn't touched. Her eyes, large and strikingly expressive, were fixed on a moth fluttering against the reinforced glass window. She didn't hear the clink of her father's silver fork or the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the guards patrolling the hallway. For Yuna, the world was a silent film, beautiful but hollow, and her father was the most distant character of all. Mr. Kang watched her, his sharp jaw tight with a grief he refused to name. To him, his daughter's deafness was a crack in his armor, a shameful secret that his enemies would use as a blade if they ever sensed his desperation. He had hired the finest surgeons from Switzerland and the most expensive tutors from Tokyo, yet they all returned the same verdict. She was unreachable. He looked at her not with the warmth of a father, but with the frustration of a king staring at a broken piece of his legacy. In the corners of the room, the household staff moved like shadows. They were trained to be invisible, to breathe without sound, and to never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the defect at the table. They treated Yuna like an inconvenience, a fragile ghost to be managed and ignored. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the heavy, suffocating pressure of things left unsaid. Tea was into this fortress of glass and ice that Mississippi Lane finally stepped, carrying a tray of tea. She was the only splash of warmth in a room that had forgotten how to burn. As she approached the table, she didn't look at the floor like the others. Her eyes moved from the Iron Shadow's cold, weary face to the little girl staring at the window, and for the first time in 7 years, someone in that house didn't see a tragedy. They saw a child waiting for a signal. The transition from the restaurant floor to the inner sanctum of the Kang estate felt like stepping into a vacuum where the air was too thin to carry a heartbeat. Mississippi Lane stood in the service corridor, her reflection in the polished obsidian walls looking small, yet her shoulders remained set with a quiet, defiant strength. Before her stood Mrs. O, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face was a map of rigid lines and whose eyes served as the primary enforcement of the Iron Shadow's laws. Mrs. O leaned in, her voice a sharp, icy whisper that barely disturbed the stillness of the hallway. She didn't offer a welcome, she offered a warning. The rules were simple, lethal, and absolute. Lane was to be a ghost among shadows. "You are here to clean, not to exist," the housekeeper hissed, her gaze darting toward the heavy double doors that led to the private quarters. Rule 1. Do not look at the boss. To meet his eye is to challenge his authority, and Mr. Kang does not tolerate challenges from the help. Lane nodded, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag, but her eyes didn't drop as quickly as the housekeeper expected. Mrs. O's expression darkened as she delivered the final, most crushing decree. Rule 2. Do not touch the girl. Do not speak to her. Do not try to comfort her. She gestured toward the room where Yuna sat in her perpetual, silent vigil. She is a porcelain doll in a glass case. You are here to polish the glass, Mississippi Lane, never to break it. As Mrs. O marched away, the clicking of her heels the only pulse in the dead air, Lane was left alone in the corridor. Through a crack in the door, she caught a glimpse of Yuna. The girl was sitting on the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold marble, perhaps trying to catch the faint, rhythmic thrum of the building's industrial generators. To the rest of the staff, Yuna was a shameful secret, a defective gear in a massive machine. But Lane, who had spent her life navigating worlds that tried to make her invisible, saw something different. She saw a child drowning in a sea of luxury, starving for a single spark of human connection. Lane looked down at the simple, battered apron she had been issued. Hidden in the deep pocket was a small, weighted object, a tool for a different kind of communication. She knew that to reach for the girl was to risk everything she had worked for, But as she watched Yuna's lonely silhouette, Lane realized that in a house built on silence, the most rebellious thing she could do was find a way to make the world vibrate. The atmosphere in the grand salon was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic edge of adrenaline. Mr. Kang sat at the center of a circle of grim-faced men, the leaders of the Seoul underworld, negotiating a deal that would consolidate his power for a generation. The room was a masterclass in controlled tension, but in the corner, the control was beginning to fray. Yuna sat on a velvet stool, her small frame trembling. A glass had shattered minutes earlier when a clumsy guard bumped a side table, and though she hadn't heard the crash, she had felt the violent vibration tear through the floorboards. To her, the room was no longer just silent. It was a chaotic landscape of flickering shadows and the heavy, aggressive energy of the men's voices vibrating through the air like thunder she couldn't name. Her breathing became shallow, and suddenly, the internal pressure boiled over. She let out a piercing, jagged scream, not a cry for help, but a raw release of sensory agony. The negotiation stopped instantly. The mob bosses looked on with thinly veiled disgust, while Mr. Kang's face turned a ghostly shade of gray, his jaw locked in a mask of suppressed fury and shame. Two massive guards rushed toward the girl, their movements frantic and heavy-handed. They tried to grab her shoulders to haul her from the room, but their touch was like fire to her overloaded nerves. Yuna began to thrash, her small hands striking out at the air, trapped in a nightmare no one else could see. "Get her out of here," one guard hissed, his fingers digging into her fragile arms. From the periphery of the room, Lane watched the disaster unfold. She saw the guard shadows looming over the child, saw the way their aggressive movements only fed Yuna's panic. Every instinct screamed at Lane to stay in the shadows, to remain the ghost Mrs. O had demanded she be. But as she saw a guard raise a hand as if to muffle the child's cries, the invisible maid vanished. Lane stepped into the light of the salon, moving with a calm, rhythmic grace that cut through the frantic energy of the room. She didn't run. She moved with a steady, grounding pace. "Step back," Lane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a note of absolute, unshakable authority that made the guards hesitate. Ignoring the lethal glare of Mr. Kang and the stunned silence of the Syndicate leaders, Lane sank to her knees on the marble floor. She didn't grab Yuna. Instead, she took the heavy, vibrating speaker from her pocket, turned it to a low, deep frequency, and placed it firmly on the floor between them. She began to hum, not for the sound, but for the steady vibration in her own chest, and held out her hands, palms up, waiting for the girl to feel the change in the room's pulse. The low, rhythmic thrum of the speaker began to ripple through the cold marble, a steady heartbeat in a room that had known only the jagged edges of silence. Yuna's thrashing didn't stop immediately. She was still caught in the storm of her own senses, her eyes darting like trapped birds. But as the deep, resonant frequency of the bass traveled from the floor into her small frame, her movements began to lose their violence. It was a language she understood, not a sound that bypassed her, but a physical presence that anchored her to the earth. Lane kept her eyes fixed solely on the child, ignoring the heavy shadow of Mr. Kang looming behind her. She could feel the lethal tension in the air, the collective breath held by the most dangerous men in Seoul. She knew that out of her peripheral vision, Mr. Kang's hand rested on the hilt of the weapon tucked into his waistband, his knuckles white with a mixture of instinctual protection and simmering rage. To him, this was an intrusion, a breach of the absolute order he demanded. But Lane didn't flinch. She placed her own hand flat on the floor beside the speaker, inviting Yuna to find the center of the vibration. Slowly, the girl's small fingers reached out. As her palm made contact with the vibrating surface, a visible shiver ran through her. The scream that had been tearing from her throat died away, replaced by a soft, hitching breath. The sensory static that had overwhelmed her was being drowned out by a singular, comforting pulse. For the first time in the history of the Kang household, the Iron Shadow saw his daughter's face soften in the presence of another human being. The room remained frozen. The Syndicate leaders watched in stunned disbelief as the defective child grew still, her forehead leaning forward until it touched Lane's shoulder, seeking the source of the rhythm. Mr. Kang's hand slowly drifted away from his belt, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. The mask of the ruthless kingpin remained, but the glassy shock in his eyes betrayed him. He looked at the black maid, the woman he had been told to ignore, and saw her doing what no doctor, no specialist, and no amount of money had ever achieved. She hadn't fixed the silence. She had learned to dance within it. The silence that returned to the salon was different now. It was no longer heavy with fear, but charged with a revelation that threatened to shatter every rule Mr. Kang lived by. The office of the Iron Shadow was a temple of cold precision, dominated by a desk of polished black glass that reflected the city lights like a dark pool of water. Mr. Kang stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the door, his silhouette cutting a jagged hole in the Seoul skyline. The door clicked shut behind Lane, and the silence that followed was sharper than any blade. When he finally turned, his eyes weren't glassy with shock anymore. They were narrowed into lethal slits of suspicion. "Who sent you?" His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that seemed to vibrate the very air. He didn't move, yet the room felt smaller, crowded by the sheer weight of his presence. He stepped toward her, the high-contrast lighting of the room casting half his face into total darkness. "No maid, no waitress from a mid-tier lounge understands the complexities of my daughter's condition. You walked into a room of the most dangerous men in this country and performed a miracle. In my world, miracles are just well-disguised traps." Lane didn't drop her gaze. She felt the phantom heat of the guard's eyes through the heavy oak doors, and she knew that one word from the man in front of her would end her story. But she thought of Yuna's small hand on the speaker, the first time the girl hadn't been afraid of the world, and her fear turned into a hard, bright spark of defiance. "No one sent me, Mr. Kang," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And it wasn't a miracle. It was physics." Kang paused, his hand hovering near the edge of his desk. "Explain." "You spent millions trying to make her hear your world," Lane said, stepping forward until she was just feet away from the man who owned the city. "But you never stopped to think about how she experiences hers. Sound is just a vibration that hasn't touched a surface yet. Yuna doesn't live in a void. She lives in a symphony of movement. She feels the heavy bass of the city, the thrum of your footsteps, the rhythm of your heart when you hold her too tight out of fear. She doesn't need a doctor to fix her ears. She needs someone to teach her how to translate the music she's already feeling through her skin." Kang stared at her, his jaw working as he processed the simplicity of her words. He had looked for a complex medical cure, a technological breakthrough, or a hidden enemy, but he had never looked at his daughter as a person with a different set of senses. For a moment, the Iron Shadow flickered, and Lane saw the fracture in his composure, the desperate father peeking through the mask of the kingpin. "You speak as if she is a puzzle to be solved," Kang whispered, the threat in his voice replaced by a haunting uncertainty. "I speak as if she is a child who has been screaming for a connection in a house that only knows how to be quiet," Lane countered. The silence that followed wasn't a threat. It was a bridge. The permission came not with a contract or a kind word, but with a silent, heavy nod in the hallway that signaled the guards to look the other way. Under the cover of the mansion's oppressive luxury, Lane began her work in the nursery, a room filled with expensive toys that had never been played with because they made no sound Yuna could appreciate. Lane pushed the plush bears aside and cleared a space on the hardwood floor, knowing the wood would act as a conductor for the new world she was building. The lessons were quiet to the ear but thunderous to the soul. Lane brought in heavy percussion instruments and specialized vibrating pads, placing Yuna's small, inquisitive hands directly onto the surfaces. At first, the girl was hesitant, her eyes searching Lane's for permission. Lane smiled, a warm, grounding contrast to the clinical coldness of the house, and struck a deep, resonant drum. The vibration bloomed through the floor, and Yuna's eyes went wide, a tiny gasp escaping her lips as the rhythm traveled up her arms and into her chest. They developed a code, a language of touch and pulse. One sharp thrum meant look, two steady beats meant wait, and a long, rolling vibration meant joy. Lane taught her to feel the difference between the frantic heartbeat of a city and the steady, calming pulse of a deep bass note. They spent hours sitting cross-legged, foreheads pressed together, Lane humming melodies against the child's skin, so Yuna could feel the physical shape of a song. For the first time, the defective label began to peel away, revealing a brilliant, hungry mind that had simply been waiting for a frequency it could catch. From the darkened surveillance room, Mr. Kang watched the monitors in a trance. He saw his daughter, a girl who had spent 7 years staring at walls, now laughing as she chased the vibrations of a speaker across the floor. He saw Lane, a woman who should have been a ghost, becoming the sun around which his daughter's world finally turned. He watched the way Yuna looked at Lane with a fierce, newfound clarity, and he felt a searing pang of jealousy mixed with a hope so sharp it was painful that he stayed in the shadows, a silent witness to the miracle he had paid for but couldn't yet join. He realized that while he had been ruling a kingdom of fear, Lane had been building a kingdom of feeling. The Iron Shadow was beginning to realize that the most powerful thing in his house wasn't his gun or his gold, but the rhythmic tapping of a small girl's hand against the floor, finally signaling back to a world that had once given up on her. The fragile piece of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound Yuna could hear, but by a concussive shockwave that Lane felt in her very teeth. A rival syndicate, sensing a moment of internal distraction within the Iron Shadow's fortress, launched a coordinated strike. The power grid flickered and died, plunging the glass palace into a terrifying, strobe-lit chaos of red emergency lights and muffled gunfire from the lower floors to high-decibel sirens wailed through the corridors, a sound designed to panic the intruders. But for Yuna, the alarms were nothing more than a violent, invisible pressure that made her world tilt. She stood frozen in the center of the nursery, her eyes wide with a primal terror as she felt the building shudder under the impact of heavy breaching charges. To her, the darkness was a silent, suffocating weight, and the vibration of the sirens felt like a physical assault on her senses. Lane didn't waste a second. She knew the guards would be focused on the front line, leaving the hidden daughter vulnerable to any assassin who slipped through the perimeter. She couldn't call out to Yuna over the din of the battle, and she couldn't afford the time it would take to drag a resisting, terrified child through a war zone. Instead, Lane dropped to the floor and grabbed a heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall. She struck it against the marble floor in a rhythmic, deliberate sequence. Thump-thump, pause, thump-thump. It was a signal they had practiced 1,000 times in the quiet of the nursery, the rhythm of safety, that Yuna's head snapped toward the source of the vibration. In the chaos of the shadows, she felt the familiar pulse traveling through the floorboards, cutting through the jagged, random shocks of the attack. She saw Lane's silhouette in the red glow, her hand extended not in a grab, but in a beckoning beat against the stone. Trusting the rhythm more than her own eyes, Yuna ran to her. Lane didn't stop to explain. She kept the beat alive, tapping a rhythmic code against Yuna's shoulder as they navigated the service ducts and hidden stairwells. While the Syndicate's high-tech security systems failed and the Iron Shadow's men fought in the dark, a maid and a child moved in perfect, silent synchronicity. Every time Yuna began to spiral into panic from the flashes of gunfire, Lane would strike a rhythmic pulse against a pipe or a wall, grounding the girl in a language that even war could not silence. They were moving through a world of violence, guided by a heartbeat that only they could feel. The dust of the siege still hung in the air, a gray shroud settling over the wreckage of the Grand Salon. Emergency lanterns flickered, casting long, tired shadows against the cracked marble walls. Mr. Kang stood in the center of the ruin, his charcoal suit torn and stained with soot, his hands trembling with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. He had won the battle, his rivals driven back into the night, but his eyes searched the shadows with a frantic, hollow desperation. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize that in the darkness, he had no way to call his daughter back to him. Then, from the service entrance, 2 figures emerged. Lane was limping slightly, her maid's uniform tattered, but her arm was wrapped fiercely around Yuna. The girl was pale, her eyes wide with the lingering shock of the vibrations, but she was unharmed at MR. Kang froze. The Iron Shadow, the man who had faced death a dozen times without blinking, looked as though he might shatter. He took a tentative step forward, but stopped, the weight of years of distance and silence paralyzing him. He didn't know how to bridge the gap. He didn't have a rhythm to offer. Lane looked from the father to the daughter. She took Yuna's small hand and placed it against a heavy metal decorative pillar that still vibrated with the low hum of the building's struggling ventilation system. Then she caught Mr. Kang's eye and nodded, a silent command for him to step into the light. Lane leaned down and tapped a specific, rhythmic sequence into Yuna's palm, a new signal they had only whispered about in their secret lessons. It was a slow, deep triple beat, followed by a steady press. Yuna's gaze snapped to her father. She watched him, really watched him, seeing the single tear tracing a path through the soot on his face. Slowly, Yuna stepped toward him. She reached out and placed her small hand flat against her father's chest, right over his thundering heart. She felt the frantic, heavy pulse of the man who had almost lost her. Her lips parted, and she didn't use her voice, but she used the rhythm Lane had taught her. She tapped her fingers against his sternum in that same triple beat, the physical translation of a name she had never heard, but had finally learned to feel. Pa! Pa! She mouthed, the silent vibration of her intent traveling through his ribcage. The stoic mass that had governed Seoul's underworld for decades didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Mr. Kang fell to his knees, his forehead dropping onto his daughter's shoulder as a jagged, broken sob escaped him. He didn't care about the Syndicate or the wreckage around them. For the first time in 7 years, the Iron Shadow wasn't alone in the dark. He held her, feeling her heartbeat sync with his own, while Lane stood in the shadows, a quiet witness to the moment a king finally became a father. In the weeks following the attack, the glass fortress of the Latte World Tower changed. The clinical, suffocating silence was replaced by a new kind of energy, a low-frequency hum that breathed life into the cold marble. Mr. Kang no longer moved through his home like a ghost of war. He moved like a man who was finally listening. He had dismantled the Syndicate's old guard, purging those who saw Yuna's deafness as a weakness, and in their place, he built a legacy that favored the observant and the resilient. He realized that Yuna wasn't a broken piece of his empire. She was its most acute sensor, possessing a strength that didn't require a shout to be felt. Lane stood in the grand foyer, her bags packed. She had fulfilled her purpose, and though her heart ached at the thought of leaving the girl who had become her shadow, she knew the rules of the underworld. She expected a silent dismissal, perhaps a heavy envelope of cash to buy her silence, and a ticket back to a world where she wasn't a target. Instead, she found Mr. Kang waiting by the elevator, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked different. The silver at his temples seemed less like a burden and more like a badge of survival. Beside him stood Yuna, her hand resting firmly on the sleeve of his charcoal suit, her eyes bright and anchored. "The housekeeper has processed your final wages," Kang said, his voice devoid of its former icy edge. He stepped forward, and for the first time he didn't loom. He stood as an equal. He didn't offer an envelope. Instead, he handed her a small, obsidian card embossed with the silver crest of the Kang family. "But money is a fleeting reward for someone who gave my daughter back her world. This card means that in any city where my name is whispered, you are untouchable. My resources are your resources. My protection is your shadow." Lane looked at the card, then at Yuna, who was tapping a rhythmic sequence against her father's wrist, the sign for friend. "I cannot let you leave as a servant," Kang continued, his gaze steady. "If you wish to finish your studies, you will do so under my patronage. But if you wish to stay, you will not be a maid. You will be the bridge. You will be family." The Iron Shadow had indeed been tamed, but not by force. He had been softened by the realization that power wasn't just in the ability to silence others, but in the courage to hear the unspoken. As Lane reached out to take Yuna's hand, the rhythm between them was perfect. The wolf had found his grace, the child had found her rhythm, and the woman who had been a ghost was finally seen.